Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am delighted to welcome you to our Munich Dialogues on Democracy evening with David Frum. And while I'm sorry that we cannot be together in one of our gorgeous new rooms at amerikahaus, it is wonderful that we can continue to bring English language events with brilliant speakers to our community using virtual technology. I'm Bartley Grosser-Richter. I'm the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy, a cooperation with the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's amerikahaus, which is the Bavarian Center for Transatlantic Relations. This is our first virtual event during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we would like to thank our members, donors, and supporters for making this possible. We are grateful for your continued support and will continue to pursue our goals for our community in these uncertain times. Tonight, or today, depending on where you're joining from, I'm very pleased to welcome back to our series David Frum, author and senior editor at The Atlantic and a sought-after political commentator. In addition to his newest book, Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy, David has authored 9 previous books, and he was speechwriter and special assistant to President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2002. Last September, we enjoyed a fantastic in-person evening with David here in Munich, which you might have been at, where he addressed the crisis of liberal democracy in America and Europe. David is still a registered Republican and has been a leading voice for the conservatives against Trump. Rather than dwell on the past, however, with his new book, he offers a very concrete vision and a map for the reinvention of American democracy going forward. So we'll be talking about David's case for believing in the possibilities of a united America once again. And since our audience and community is overwhelmingly international, let's also talk about the future of US foreign policy, alliances, and treaties while we're at it. You can ask questions during the conversation on the YouTube live page or via email to program@amerikahaus.de. Let me spell it, it's in German. program at amerikahaus.de. My fantastic partners there are directing the technical aspect tonight and will be fielding the questions for us as well. And we'll try to get to as many as possible in the 1 hour that we have. So hello, David, and welcome back. Can we get David?
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And before we get going, I'd like to introduce one more person into the conversation tonight. I was just telling David, reading the acknowledgements in his new book, he mentioned a classmate of mine who I have recently connected with through mutual friends. And when I read Jeff Cabaservice's name, I thought it would be fun to have him pop in as well. So from Florida, please welcome Jeffrey Cabaservice.
Hi, great to be with you all.
Jeff is the director of political studies at the Niskanen Center, which is a think tank in Washington. And you might know him for his New York Times notable book of the year called Rule and Ruin, Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party, or from his articles in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian. So this is a shout out to our mutual friends and to the Yale class of '88. And Jeff, please feel free to jump in to ask and answer any questions you feel appropriate. I should add that David, you and Jeff are obviously go way back from what I read in the book. So super. I must say, David, I thoroughly enjoyed the book and I have so much I'd like to talk about tonight, but to open, would you like to give our audience a brief idea about why you wrote the book and how you chose to structure it?
Bartley, thank you. That's wonderful. I'm so happy to be back with you and with Jeff as well. So I won't give you a long lecture, just a couple of preliminary points. The first is about the title. And I'll admit, when the editor proposed the title to me, I thought, I think things are going to be bad, but that bad? But you know, marketing is marketing. And then sure enough, you be careful what you say, because we did indeed have the apocalypse arrive. I wrote the book under house arrest. I'm living under house arrest now. And of course, now at the end of June, we see a revival of the COVID threat, this time in the interior of the United States. But there's something more about the title, and this is very pertinent to our discussion tonight. While we casually use the word apocalypse to mean catastrophe, end of the world, that is not, in fact, what literally it means. Apocalypse is a compound of 2 Greek words that mean to remove the drapery from something, to unveil something, in other words, to reveal. The apocalyptic literature of 2,000 years ago, written by Jews and people who would soon be called Christians, showed the future. Now, what the future they saw was a future in which the world would, as they knew it, would be overthrown, and a new heaven and a new earth would be revealed. But apocalypse does not have to mean destruction. It just means revelation. And so that is what I try to deal with in this book, is what will the world be like after Donald Trump? So it's a backward look at the period since my previous book on Trump, Trumpocracy, which is a study of Donald Trump's power, and a forward look at what comes next. And let me, without monologuing much longer, say something about what is maybe for tonight the most pertinent part of that future. The hardest part of the damage done by Donald Trump to repair will be the damage to America's position in the world. The United States is at the center of a network of alliances. Those alliances are voluntary, and they're based above all on trust. Germany, of course, has been a special target of this president's anger and prejudice. He's done so much harm to the US-German relationship. I think all Americans can express to our friends in Germany how much we regret that and how much we look forward to recreating this so important partnership and friendship between the two countries. But I think with Germany, at least, there's enough history and goodwill on both sides that you can see how this path will be. It's harder when you imagine how do things go with new partners like India and Vietnam, Indo-Pacific countries that are going to be so crucial to any American effort to bring some rule to bear on China's relationship with the rest of the world. So those are things that are very much on my mind to worry about. This book is an attempt to look forward. I try to look with some optimism, but also realism.
Okay, super, thank you. Well, you've been on a virtual book tour for a month now. It's not really probably how you imagined to be doing your book tour.
It is.
And ever since the book has come out, so much has happened. Since your book came out, we've had George Floyd's killing spark a worldwide protest movement, Black Lives Matter. You mentioned yourself, the pandemic is surging, and there are states like Florida, Arizona, Texas that are looking like Italy at its worst. John Bolton's book dropped. Michael Flynn case just yesterday. Writing about Trump is dangerous because the news cycles are so rapid. Have any of your thoughts or predictions changed?
Well, yes, things change, and no, they don't. I have a couple of mantras that have guided me through writing about Donald Trump. And one of them is I've repurposed an old saying about Italy, coined by Luigi Barzini, the great scholar of that country, that with Trump, there are many secrets, but no mysteries. The essentials of what is going on here have been visible to all. And one of the things that always defines Trump scandals is there's very little cover-up. With Flynn, with the Roger Stone story, it all happens in plain view. Anyone can see. There's no mystery that Donald Trump intervened in prosecutions to protect his friends. That's all just as flagrant as could be. So while many of the details, of course, overtake you, the essentials of the story do not. And that applies too to the George Floyd killing. Now, that's probably the most momentous thing, the aftermath to the Floyd killing that has happened since the book came out. But in both Trumpocalypse and Trumpocracy before, I talked about how the Trump presidency was opening the door to a new wave of social reform in the United States. And that what we were seeing and what we would see in the 2020s was a movement like that of the 1960s or the 1840s, one of these surges of American consciousness. So movements of social and personal and moral reform. They often are very complicated. They often don't achieve what they set out to do, but they come from something deep in the American character, the places where the temperance movement and abolition came from in the 1840s, where the social movements of the 1960s came from. I think we're living through one of those moments now with all the attendant ambiguity, uncertainty, and moral complexity.
Okay, yeah. I've got a question that maybe is a nice broad one to open up from Jane in Munich. And you touched on it, but does America really understand how this is playing out abroad? Do you think?
Well, America is a big place that contains a lot of people. So many Americans, of course, do not. But those who care about America's standing in the world, I think do. And yet it is always true when we judge ourselves. Even if we know we're at fault, we're always more charitable with ourselves than we are with others, and more charitable than we should be. So I don't know that American policymakers understand the harm they have done. Just how many things that once seemed unthinkable now seem thinkable. Now, there have been many disputes between America and its friends going back to our parents' time. That's not new. And I lived through in the dispute over the Iraq War, a lot of ill will back and forth across the Atlantic. But what is different now is America's friends have real cause to question the stability of America's government, America's commitment to democratic values and norms. And as the country that has been the guardian of those things through the 20th century, that can be very disorienting, and especially I'm sure for our friends in Germany, where Germany built so many of its institutions, taking for granted its participation in a world built by the United States. The European Union is possible only because of an American security guarantee. Without that guarantee, Europe would have to decide whether to be a military power too, and that would open all kinds of discussions. What the American guarantee allowed Europe to say is we're going to divide our policy. We'll have a military policy that we do through NATO with the Americans and the Canadians, and an economic policy and a trade policy that we'll do inside this other institution. And if we can't trust the United States, then Europe has to take on new roles that it wasn't designed to do. So that's very stressful. And I think one of the things that Americans tend not to understand is how much Europe has become an integrated whole. And I think I've had so many experiences in this light, but there are two that always stand out. Back in the 1990s, I attended a defense planning event at the town of Colmar in Alsace, a very, very beautiful town if you haven't had the opportunity to build it. And it was a joint Franco-German defense conference. And at one of the cocktail receptions, I was talking to one of the German officers, and I said something banal about it was moving to see French and German officers meeting so peaceably and planning together in a town in Alsace. And the officer said, yes, he said, I've never understood what all of that was about. If you want a house in Alsace, why don't you just buy one? Okay, that took a lot of institutional making. But the other story that I remember was in the spring of 2015, I took my college-age son on a tour of the Western Front. And we started in Flanders and we drove all the way down through the American zone to Verdun. And then at the end of our tour, which took us 2.5 weeks, we closed the doors in the car and drove back from the bottom of the Western Front to Brussels Airport, crossing through France, Luxembourg, and Germany, stopped for lunch in Germany, ended up back in Brussels, took a plane back to the United States. And the whole drive back took us about 2.5 hours. And through crossing all of these frontiers with just a sign as if, welcome to Pennsylvania. And I don't think Americans appreciate the magnitude of that accomplishment and how Donald Trump's hatred for it, distrust of it, how much it attacks something, I think, very central to European identity, that this is the most important, most significant, most benign thing we've ever done as a continent, and you don't believe in it.
Very true. There was a question here. I was going to do something else, but this might be a good time to talk about the withdrawal of troops from Germany that Trump is toying with right now.
Right. Well, I think this is one of those instances where Donald Trump says things and it's not clear, and there's no paper behind it. So does he intend to close the military hospital? This is the largest military hospital outside the United States is in Germany. And as I understand, I have never toured it, I'm sorry to say, but I understand it's just completed a major and very expensive renovation to overhaul what's basically a 1950s building. That money was just spent. So you're going to move a hospital, which is a major with a highly specialized trauma care unit. And I'm sure many of the medical professionals who work there have spouses who have jobs in the area too. They can't relocate so easily. And there's all kinds of infrastructure. So the pharmacies and the laboratories. I mean, how do you move all of those? I wonder how much it's going to mean. One of the institutions that through the Trump years has been most independent of the president, Trumpocalypse talks a lot about the success or failure of institutions. And one of the institutions that has been most resistant to him is the US military. And of course they obey orders, and of course they recognize civilian superiority. But the army can obey orders fast or can obey orders a little slower. And in the Trump case, many of those orders have been obeyed more slowly. And I think the order about rotating the troops out of Germany, if President Trump is still there in January to check that the order is executed, I'm confident, unfortunately, that it will be. But if he's not, he may find that they've just completed the planning in time for Inauguration Day.
Okay. Yeah, in your book, you had a couple of chilling statistics to that when you say 90% of French and Germans have no confidence in Trump, and that almost half of the Germans have come to regard China as a more reliable partner than Trump's America.
Well, I think those pro-China comments are just a way that polls capture anti-American sentiment. It's hard to imagine that thoughtful people in Germany really do have much trust in China. And of course, that poll was taken before the pandemic. Which has been so surrounded by China, horrifying Chinese official line. And one of the things that this pandemic should remind us is how brittle authoritarian states are and how strong democracies are, that the ability of reporters to go expose official lies is a tremendous resource. And China doesn't have that resource. So the officials can get away with lying for months and months. And in a free country, they can get away with it for maybe days and days, if that. But it is a real problem. And we are going to have to do a lot of work, both on an official level and on a person-to-person level, to try to rectify it.
Yeah, good segue into your chapter called Great Again, where you say that Donald Trump supposed US power rested on military hardware and the readiness to use violence, but he never understood how much of American power came from other people's idea of America as a land of hope and promise. And your colleague and our first guest, Ann Applebaum, had an article out this week about the purge at the Voice of America, which directly relates to that, which again, today, this afternoon, I think is in flux again. But
Well, the Voice of America story is a very Trumpy story because it combines, there's a line attributed to Talleyrand, I don't know if he really said it, about Tsarist Russia, that it was despotism mitigated by assassination. And then some Viennese wit upgraded that, repurposed that to say the Habsburg Empire was despotism mitigated by schlumperei, slovenliness. And that's the Trump thing, is that they have dictatorial instincts, but the slovenliness always gets in the way. I mean, what is going on at Voice of America is just a big part of what is going on there is it's a place where Trump is parking a lot of people who, even by the standards of Trump supporters, are uniquely unemployable. And so he's given them this job to just where they will end up destroying things. Some of the damage is intentional, and some of it is just because they're not very good at things and are going to and don't understand that a broadcaster, above all, depends on public trust. People decide whether to believe you or not. And that is a reputation that is painstakingly earned and quickly lost. So that idea that American power rests on consent is especially urgent in this era of the rise of China. When I worked in the Bush administration, not 2 decades ago, depending on how you count, the American economy was anywhere from 3 times to 6 times bigger than the Chinese economy. And today, depending on how you count, the American economy it's percentage points bigger. So I think the figure I've seen that is most often cited is that the Chinese economy is about 80% that of the United States economy. So we're near peers. So the United States can't simply bark orders at people anymore. It can't bark orders at China, that's for sure. And if it's going to balance China, it needs the cooperation by consent of many friends, and not just the familiar friends in Europe, but new friends, India, Vietnam, the Philippines, others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, super. Thank you. Maybe back to Germany on this, because Germany has suffered a lot from the surprise in the aggressiveness of the anti-German rhetoric coming out. And they just suffered through 2 years of a really difficult ambassador.
Yeah. Yes.
So that one is going to take a while. In this last week in the FATS, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, unprecedented. 2 politicians from the SPD and the FDP, all of the other political parties, said they hoped he would be a persona non grata, and that he was an utter and complete failure. And to have that said about an American ambassador is extraordinary.
Yeah. the only assurance we can take is, as I think everyone watching this Zoom call will understand, that the stronger the relationship between two countries, the less the ambassador matters. And the flow of connections between Germany and the United States, economic, military, anti-counterterrorism, environmental, working on standards of privacy standards for technology companies, person to person, business investment and business investment. Those are really thick. And the sophistication with which Germans, so many of whom have been educated in the United States, approach American society means they understand 335 million people, and a certain fixed percentage of them are going to be jerks. And just statistically, some of them end up working in the US government. It's just the law of large numbers here at work. And sorry, you got the unlucky one, but on the other hand, maybe you'll forgive us more than Azerbaijan would if we, there's enough goodwill there. But what is going to be important is how we renew, because we are going to have to build new kinds of international institutions in the 21st century. The pandemic has exposed one, and the environmental challenges that are following. I think one of the big lessons to take from the pandemic is that long anticipated problems do not always arrive gradually. Sometimes they can arrive very suddenly, and climate may be like this. It may be that with climate, we have problem, and then suddenly whammo, it becomes something so enormous we cannot ignore it. And we're going to need a global regime, both to set a price for carbon, to incentivize institutions and firms to begin to reduce carbon, and then eventually to take the carbon out of the air. And we are going to need to constrain China and India. And because they are so big and so rich, we are not going to be able to constrain them one by one. We're going to need some common purpose. And the book offers some mechanisms. One of the things about a carbon tax that is not thought about enough is that a carbon tax also becomes a carbon tariff, just the way a VAT does. A VAT imposes a cost at the frontier on the inbound goods and then remits the cost on outbound. Well, you can do that with a carbon tax as well. And if you can make that frontier big enough, if you can say, well, there's a carbon tax around the NAFTA bloc, there's a carbon tax around the European Union, plus maybe the United Kingdom. And if those two blocks can work together, that they have an agreed price on carbon, then that's suddenly enough of an economic unit that they can become a price giver to the rest of the world and say to India and China, you're going to be paying, you can either agree to pay this price voluntarily, or it's going to be assessed on your products anyway, and your services too, which is an even more challenging task. But again, that is not technically impossible to say, we're going to have to put a carbon tariff on, if this X-ray is read by an Indian radiologist remotely rather than by a radiologist here, there still has to be a tariff applied on that service to make up for the cost of the Indian computer system's carbon emissions.
Okay, that was a really good segue, because I wanted to talk about the reforms that you talk about in your book, rather than dwelling on the past. I got a call yesterday from a friend who said, the topic of your talk is post-Trump. Do you really think there's going to be a post-Trump?
Well, that Trump is in the book was all written on the assumption that Trump would probably lose. The parts of the book that were written in 2018 and 2019 were written on the assumption that Donald Trump would probably lose. And I think today it just seems that it's almost impossible that he wouldn't. We have the unemployment situation in the United States continues to deteriorate, and any hope Donald Trump never understood that any hope he had of getting reelected, depending on the economy beginning to grow again by the third quarter of the year. And the only hope for the economy to begin growing again in the third quarter was to have the disease situation stabilize. And because he refused to do that, we're now in a situation where the disease is getting worse. And therefore we can chart this with data from two data sources I saw just the other day. One is from credit card companies, and the other is from a payroll company that can track small business payroll management. We can see that in key states, Florida and Texas, economic activity, which had risen steadily through the month of May and the first week in June, is now shrinking again as businesses shut down in the face of losing customers because of the virus.
Yeah. Well, to go back to what you're talking about, then reforms necessary going forward in order to make the political climate, how should we go? Or in your book, you talk about, I liked when you talked about reforming after Watergate.
Yeah.
I loved that. Was it Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Tip O'Neill who said, right?
The central conservative insight is that culture matters more than politics. The central liberal insight is that politics can change culture.
What do you think?
I think that's right. And I think we're going to look, we had after Watergate 4 years of major reforms at the federal and the state level, probably a burst of reform legislation unlike anything since the progressive era, because it dealt above all with the institutions of government. Making elections more transparent and more fair, making the administration of justice more honest, putting new oversight upon the national security agencies. And I think we are going to see something like that in the next 2 years. And I recommend that we should. And these are reforms to, for example, make law enforcement more independent. I mean, it is, in Germany, I looked this up for the book, when prosecutors ultimately report to a director of public prosecutions who's appointed by the president of the state in consultation with the minister of justice, who may or may not belong to the same party as the chancellor, and often does not belong to the same party as the chancellor. If the chancellor of Germany were to give orders to a prosecutor, after the prosecutor overcame the prosecutor's astonishment, I think the chancellor would be arrested. But in the United States, federal prosecutors are political appointees, and they report to an assistant attorney general for the criminal division, who is a political appointee, who reports to the deputy attorney general, who is a political appointee. And while Donald Trump has been, on the whole, unsuccessful in deploying prosecutors to attack his opponents, he has been disturbingly successful at protecting his friends who have committed crimes from prosecution. So I think one of the things I talk about in the book is how we need to make our prosecutorial services more independent. I talk about the need to bring our financial disclosures into a new era. That many of the rules of presidential integrity are not written down. There isn't a rule that a president cannot operate a private business while president. No one wrote it down because no one thought anyone would do such a thing. Well, Donald Trump has done it. So now we're going to need some new rules. We're going to need new kinds of disclosures. And then beyond the political, there are social reforms we need, because in all of our societies, and Donald Trump is not there are Trumps everywhere. There are Trumps in Germany, there are Trumps in France. These kinds of demagogues draw their power from social division. And in the 21st century, those social divisions have become much worse than they were in the last 20 years of the 20th century. Now, some of that we can't control, but some of it we can. We can narrow some of those divisions between, economically strong metropolises and economically laggard hinterlands. We can think very hard about how do we revive the institution of marriage, because we have men and women living apart. And so this extraordinary gender gap in the voting behavior of the sexes that reflects this extraordinary social gap between sexes who increasingly live alone. A majority of Americans under 30 now live without a partner, which is unheard of in the history of statistics. More Americans under 30 live with a parent than live with a married spouse. And that is a profoundly destabilizing thing for a society, and it creates mistrust between groups. We have rising mistrust between young and old. The old who are drawing more from the state, the young who feel they're paying in more. So the book again and again talks about, not that you can cure all of these things because there are limits to what you can do in politics, but you can make things less bad so as to give less fuel to a would-be demagogue.
Which several people have submitted questions talking about the polarization in America, and that would be one of your solutions to try to.
Well, I have one of my big sort of macro solutions is to say the way you mitigate polarization is by creating a stronger sense of national unity. And so I look for ways to. So I have a couple of big suggestions about that, but one of them is, in other countries, one of the things that defines you as a citizen of a state is you get your healthcare through the state. You get it just because you're French, just because you're German, just because you're British. And that makes you attached in a very material way to your state. It provides something that's deeply meaningful to you. So I talk about how we can thicken social provision in the United States, but at the same time, you also need to say, you can't just show up and be an American, that at the same time as you thicken the connections between Americans, you have to thicken the boundary between America and the rest of the world. So you need more immigration enforcement to go along with your higher level of social provision. And I also talk about political changes because, look, polarizing comes partly from the society, but also partly from the way our party system is designed. And there are things, and I talk about this in the book, that you could do to create more incentives for compromise between the parties.
Like what?
Well,
because that seems such a long shot right now, looking at the Congress. Really.
Well, right now, I'm going to focus especially on the Republicans because the fault is not equally on both sides. This is mostly a Republican problem. Republicans have discovered, especially with their grip on local government since 2010, that they are able to shrink the electorate. That they can win power, not by winning a majority of the people or even a majority of the vote, but by winning a minority while disenfranchising people who don't vote like them. And that has been a very profitable way of doing politics. So I talk a lot in the book about taking away the option of voter suppression. If Republicans knew that every adult citizen had an equal opportunity to vote, and that those votes would count not perfectly equally because the Constitution doesn't allow that, but more equally than they do now, they'd have to compete. They couldn't say, we're content to win our 42%. In a two-party system, you get 42%, you're a loser. The only reason Republicans can think that Donald Trump was doing well was because they knew, well, 45% approval, we are going to be able to disqualify enough of the overall vote that our 42 to 45% can give us power. Well, take that option away. Make it clear, your 42 to 45% translates to defeat. You have to get yourself up to 48. And that means you cannot do the kind of racially polarizing, socially polarizing, misogynistic things that the Republicans have been doing since 2010 and especially since 2016. If you take away the option of shrinking the electorate, you force the option of making the party bigger.
Okay. I've got a question from Kit in Munich who's skeptical. And she asks, if the media landscape doesn't change, is reform like that really possible?
Well, most of us who care a lot about politics, when we say the media landscape, we mean in the American context, the New York Times, the Washington Post, broadcasters like National Public Radio. We may mean the cable networks, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. But for the vast majority of Americans, the media means Facebook. That is far and away the most important media company in the country, followed by YouTube, owned by Google. That's where most Americans get their political information. I don't know that there's much you can do. Facebook has chosen a toxic strategy, and to some degree, they can be shamed out of it. But in the end, their business model, which relies on robots to police human speech, is not consistent with any kind of media ethics. Because the human beings will always outsmart the algorithm. And the only way to outsmart the human beings is to hire human beings, and then Facebook loses money and goes out of business. But I think we need to be mindful of this question, which is we are very focused on the supply of disinformation. I think we ought to pay attention to the question of why is there so much demand for it? And this is Cartel and Trumpocracy, the first of the two Trump books. The single most circulated fake news story of 2016 was a story that Pope Francis had endorsed Donald Trump.
Right.
Now, I'm not a Catholic, but if I were Catholic enough to care about the Pope's endorsement, I think I'd be Catholic enough to know that the Pope doesn't do endorsements. No one who would be moved by the Pope's endorsement would be unaware enough of the Pope to imagine that the people who loved the story, enjoyed the story, forwarded the story, at some level had to know the story could not be true. The Pope didn't endorse John F. Kennedy. The Pope didn't endorse Al Smith. The Pope doesn't. The Pope is not. Donald Trump had just personally insulted. So there's if he wasn't going to endorse the first Catholic to run for president, the first Catholic president, he certainly wasn't going to endorse the person who had personally insulted him 5 months before. And everyone who circulated that story at some deep level had to know it could not be true. And yet they enjoyed it. So why were they vulnerable? They were vulnerable because not of something in Facebook, but of something in them. And that deserves more attention than it gets.
Yeah, and I think that's a tough one. And that is a really nice segue into quite a bit of your book when you talk about the fact that even if the government changes in January, those people aren't going anywhere, and there are compatriots.
Yes.
And you talk about revenge. I have a question here from someone named Mark Clark, who writes, there's been an unprecedented amount of wrongdoing by members of the Trump administration. If Joe Biden were to win in November, what should his administration do about this wrongdoing? Should they follow a policy of retribution, investigation, and punishing all of the wrongdoings, or should they try a truth and reconciliation approach a la Nelson Mandela? Now, there's sort of two sides here, I guess. We were just talking about the people in the country versus the people in the government, but.
So, well, let's chop this question into three parts. So the first part is the actual people who have actually done wrong things, sometimes quite petty wrong things, like there's never been as much chiseling on expenses. Remember Donald Trump's first EPA administrator who just ran up a massive bill. I mean, the Trump cabinet secretaries spend much more money on travel and things like that than and there are ways within the government of dealing with that. And so for most of those things, I would say for the Biden administration, just you let the ordinary rules of government take their course. If people have chiseled on their expenses, that catches up with them. If people have broken the laws, state or federal, you let justice take its course. Donald Trump and his family will have a lot of liability. They almost surely have cheated on their taxes. The New York Times published a big story relying on information we now know from Donald Trump's niece that they called him they accused him of tax fraud in so many words, they dared him to sue, and he didn't. If Donald Trump was regularly cheating on his taxes until 1995, which is when the story stops, it's a good bet that the habits of a lifetime didn't stop in 1995. So he'll have to face all of those things. So actual formal, personal, individual wrongdoing takes its course. And after there have been convictions, President Biden can consider whether pardons are called for in certain cases. I will say personally, in the Michael Flynn case, I think Michael Flynn deserves to be convicted for lying to the FBI, but he served his country, and I would hate to see him go to prison. I think that a process where he gets either a non-prison sentence or a pardon, in light of his earlier services. I mean, he's not a criminal like Paul Manafort. He's not a hoodlum like Roger Stone. He's a person who got promoted beyond his abilities and then went a little crazy and then did some bad things. So there may be individual judgments this person should get a pardon on. Okay, so that's one category. The second category are the enablers, people who have been important, who have not broken any law, not committed any crime, but who in important ways have done real harm to the culture of the country. And then we will make our own individual judgments. Many of the people I'm talking about are people who used to be friends of mine, in a couple of cases, very good friends of mine. Can I imagine having tea with them again in the future? That's hard to see. But life is long, and perhaps, we want to be charitable, as we would expect charity ourselves for our own wrongdoings. Maybe we will judge them in different ways. But that's a question of moral judgment. The third piece is, what do you do, as you said at the beginning, about the millions of fellow Americans who either were deluded by this man, or who, because of their own bigotries and prejudices and ignorance, followed after him and enabled all of this to happen? And as you said, they're not going anywhere. So my suggestion with them is we have to make the political system of the United States more representative, so that 1/3 of the country doesn't find it is easy to do harm to 2/3 of the country, as it does now. But we also have to understand we're going to have to all find ways to live together. And that's going to require some level of understanding them and their challenges, the way the world looks at them, and without agreeing with them, forgiving them. I mean, I think we can see an end to this strange thing where we'd send reporters into diners to talk to elderly reactionaries about their reactionary views. I mean, I had Trumpocalypse. I have a story. I tell some stories about this where I talk about a diner in this town in Ohio, where I think a reporter from the Washington Post interviews people and reports that no one in this diner in this town in Ohio thinks the Trump-Russia affair is a big deal. Say, okay, fine. that town has a smaller population than the Westwood neighborhood in Western Los Angeles, south of UCLA. So, are you sending reporters to Westwood to report on what the UCLA faculty think? Because it's the same, or that the county in Pennsylvania, Luzerne County, where Hazleton, Pennsylvania is, and that was traversed by a reporter. All that whole county, which occupies a huge swath of land, is home to fewer people than live in Manhattan, south of Washington Square Park. So we have to rediscover, the rest of the country, and remember that urban America, it's produced. The Hillary Clinton counties produce 2/3 of the country's wealth. That deserves some consideration too.
Absolutely. Interestingly, you might have seen it this week in the German newspaper Die Zeit. There was an article by Klaus Brinkbäumer that leaned heavily on Anne Applebaum's work for The Atlantic. And it was entitled US Republicans, a Bunch of Cowards. And he leans on Anne's article, which is coming out this summer, but is already online, about collaboration and why people agree with or support Enable when they might not have thought it was right. Correct. And he takes it a step further. Anne always said, Anne's point was, why are Republicans doing this? Because what could really happen to them? If you are a cabinet member, you're going to land at the Harvard Kennedy School as a professor. It's not so bad. Brinkbäumer in German goes further, and he calls them a miserable pack of cowards.
Yeah. Well, look, I've lived this story for a long time. I'm a Republican who's been at some odds with my party now, going back to the late to the 2006-07. I began to get into some trouble. So this is something I have lived. And when you fall out in a city like Washington with former friends, obviously you're not going to be arrested. You're not going to be even harassed. It can hurt your income. You may earn less money than you otherwise would, and some people should, of course, care about that. But that's the real pressure. Is very few of us are equipped to lead lives of mental independence, where just people disapprove of you and make it clear that they disapprove of you. Former friends gossip about you behind your back. You just become isolated. And there are no material consequences, but these are free countries, they're rule of law states. Again, nothing too terrible is going to happen to you. But people crack under these pressures. We've all been through high school. We all know what conformists people are by nature. And having lived it, I think yes, obviously they're not heroes. But as a great German writer said, unhappy is the land that has need for heroes. Because most of us aren't heroes. There are very few who are. My family and my wife and I have been obsessed over the past few weeks watching a French series called French Village, which I recommend to people. It's about the story of one imaginary town in the Jura under German occupation for 5 years. And the point of the story is how there are a very tiny number of people who are consistently good. And there are a slightly larger number of people who are consistently wicked. And most people align somewhere along the way and are sometimes one thing and sometimes another. And most of the time they're driven just by their own imaginations of what could go wrong. And I think that is really true here in Washington, that Republicans have done this. And I want to say this is not a Republican specific thing. Very fortunately, Jeremy Corbyn never won power in the United Kingdom. But look at the people in the Labor Party who went along with him. I mean, he was an anti-Semite. He was a conspiracist. He was somebody who would associate with all kinds of extremist anti-democratic forces. How few people in his own party stood up to him? How many quietly went along? And so I think we can judge, but we should also, when we judge, we should always judge with charity, because we all get tested, and let's see how we stand up to the test ourselves.
That's a good segue. And again, Jeff, feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts on this. Will the Republican Party be able to establish an intellectual elite after the Trump presidency? And which principal issues and objectives should the Republican Party embrace, aiming at political legitimacy and majorities in the coming years? That's pretty broad.
Yeah. Well, first, there needs to be a good dose of learning through pain. The first step, I would say, the bigger the Biden victory in 2020, the better, and the better for the Republican Party. The sooner and the more fully the Republican Party recovers. Republicans really need to see that the Trump experiment did not work, and indeed that they were punished for it. And it cost them the Senate as well as the presidency. As that is absorbed, as the idea, and as people who got too close to Trump are sort of flushed out of the political system, we will see new generations of leaders arise, starting from the states, which is where the Republican Party regenerates from. And we're going to see new issues come to the fore. I think, we have, as the reaction to the George Floyd killing shows, I mean, we have been re-arguing issues left over from the late 1960s now for half a century. And it really is past time that the climate issue becomes central to our politics. It really is past time that the question of how do we find meaningful employment for people in an era when the robots are going to do the industrial work? How do we reconcile men and women and get revived marriage and childbearing in societies that are far below replacement? How do we manage immigration in a world in which it costs just a couple of $100s to get from any place to any place, and a few $100s? Let's have, and though as the new issues arise, the new political formations will appear. And of course, the Biden administration and the Democratic Party will overreach and overstep and make mistakes and mismanage things. And as they make their errors, then the corrective work of politics will advance. But the first step, the precondition, is put Trumpism behind us and make everyone understand that crime did not pay.
Ron, it would be all right if I jump in here for a second.
Yes, please.
David has seen far too much of me lately. And in fact, David, I actually watched your interview with Nick Peston yesterday on ITV. So I'm even become one of your stalkers. And there really is basically no difference between my views and David's, except possibly how you spell the name Jeffrey. Other than that.
You mean you spell it correctly and I don't?
I'm not going to say. But here's a question, David, about the future of the Republican Party. Parties traditionally have adjusted to the market. And if they discover that the public doesn't like what they're selling, then they adjust their product to some extent. Both parties have not stood for the same thing from time immemorial. And in fact, the Republican Party now stands a lot for what the Democratic Party used to stand for, and vice versa. But in your talk yesterday with Nick Peston, you mentioned that there were a lot of labor people who'd voted labor their whole lives, who had some kind of class identity that aligned with labor, and they looked at Jeremy Corbyn and said, "That's not me. I'm voting for the other side." And I feel we've seen much the same go on in the United States with the college-educated middle class. Mm-hmm. This is a group that used to significantly vote Republican, and they look at Donald Trump and the party he stands for, and they say, "Nope, not me." And they may go back, it's true. But if you look at what's actually happened in the states where the Republican Party has been diminished significantly, let's say California, Oregon, Washington State particularly, you actually find the Trump Party getting crazier and Trumpier with every passing election. Oregon has now nominated a QAnon advocating lunatic to be its senatorial candidate. And these people do not want to share power or even admit the moderates and the middle class back into their party. So what's going to have to happen for the party to actually significantly readjust its image, start appealing to minorities in a way that would actually bring back the middle class?
Look, a possible future, and the California example is very pertinent here, is it may be that we go in for an extended period, and we have seen this before, where we have factional politics instead of party politics. And in the state of California, the political energy is between business Democrats and progressive Democrats. And the Republicans just aren't a factor. So like the present mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, who would have been a very attractive Democratic candidate for president in 2020, couldn't run because he was a business Democrat and he had made too many enemies among progressive Democrats. He couldn't unite his local Democratic Party behind him. And that's a way that American politics might evolve in the near term. I hope not, because here's the huge problem with factional politics, which is it's very hard to understand unless you pay a lot of attention to politics. Most of us get at any given moment the difference between a Democrat and a Republican. But you have to really have a scorecard to keep track between the various kinds of Democrats on in the Los Angeles city and county governments, and who's more pro-business and who's more progressive. So it disadvantages people who don't want to obsessively follow politics. But as California's has been a one-party state now for more than a decade. And it can last for a while. I think eventually what happens, an issue comes up where that cuts across the line, and where the progressive Democrats and the business Democrats will find themselves unable to cohabit. And in California, what keeps them all together is that all California Democrats look at Washington, D.C. and say, those Republicans aren't us. So, we all agree we're not like them, even as much as we disagree with each other. But that can happen in the national issue. And parties do tend to coalesce around great issues. And we have not had, since the end of the Cold War, we've not had a great reorganization of the parties. What we've had is instead a slow drift. We used to have politics, 68 rearranged the party system. The end of the Cold War took a lot of the urgency out of the party system, and then let the Republicans congeal and let the Democrats sort of blur. And they sort of sifted across the Republican line. But there will be such issues again, and maybe the long-running response to COVID. If it turns out there isn't a vaccine showing up quickly, and we do have to make major decisions and changes, we may reorganize our politics around that, or it may be climate, or something else I can't think of.
Yeah, thank you, David. I just wanted to add, as I drop out, that Trumpocalypse is a great book, and it's been a real pleasure to see David evolve from being just a sharp political thinker to a really profound thinker at this point. It's been gratifying to see this.
Okay, bye-bye. So I lost your sound, Riley.
Sorry, that was my fault. I've had quite a few questions come through while you've been talking that I'm going to try to lump into one about trust. What you've been talking about with the trust in the U.S. People, I think, here, like you said, know enough Americans to know that America is good and Americans are good. But the thought that if it happened once, it could happen again with an election, and all of a sudden the disruption is there. Several questions have come in about that and how to deal with it. And I want to segue, because we're coming close to the end. You end your book with a chapter against revenge.
Yeah.
And you've done some really fascinating research, what I think would be very interesting for our audience, on West Germany. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be something interesting to talk about.
Well, West Germany, without over dramatizing comparison, I became, in the Trump years, obsessed with the history of Germany. Not the history that most Americans read between 1930 and 1945, but between 1945 and 1965. And the birth of a truly democratic political culture. How does that happen? Germany went through terrible, painful experiences, and then it brought forth a new generation that had absorb new values, also because of new possibilities. And we may need to have that some kind of similar political regeneration here. But as to the question about trust and what you should do, look, there's what I feel as a North American with a North American feelings, and what I know I would have to think if I were a German or French or European generally, which is what I feel is we need to put things back together the way they were. What I know and what I think you would have to think on your side is, of course, you have to assume this could happen again. And that is going to mean that Europe is going to need to be less, as Chancellor Merkel said, that Europe cannot afford to rely so completely on the United States for its security. And that makes me sad to say that, but intellectually, I know that just has to be true. And so you're going to have to invest in some capabilities. In the new world, I think intelligence capabilities are much more important than traditional military capabilities. We've wasted a lot of money in the Trump years buying new rockets and tanks and battleships. We're all ready to fight a war from vintage 1985. We're not so good against computer hacks and shutdowns of hospital services. So you can, like a third world country building a cell system without bothering with landlines, you can leapfrog us a little bit and worry less about your military and more about your intelligence capabilities, asymmetric warfare. But I think Europeans do have to assume the chance is always there. They're going to be providing more of their own security, and not just against traditional territorial threats like those from Russia, but against ideological threats and intelligence threats from China and from other great power players. Unfortunately, our America's error is going to push Europe into a position where it just cannot afford not to stand more on its own 2 feet.
I think that, is unarguable. Okay, I don't have any more questions from anybody that needs to. Do you have anything you want to close with?
I just want to thank everyone for their hospitality again. And I hope I'm scheduled to be back in Germany in December, and I hope very much that will be possible. I wish us all health and well-being in a challenging time.
Thank you. And I want to take this moment then to thank the team at amerikahaus. Dominic and Joanna, who've been running everything from the back. Say hi. Super. And what many people don't know, and I think is especially interesting if you guys, hi, Joanna, if you guys are not in Munich, they do an extraordinary amount of education. This is an organization that is dedicated to the Transatlantic Alliance. And one of the things, because you talk about gerrymandering quite a bit in your book, and amerikahaus does teacher training for all the teachers in Bavaria that teach high school kids English and teaches them about the Electoral College so that these German students understand the very complicated Electoral College. And I think that's a really good thing. And so I want to give a shout out to amerikahaus because they're doing, amongst other things, great events, and follow their website. It's a really a good thing that they're doing. So David, thank you very, very much. The book is Trumpocalypse, and I can only second Jeffrey. I really enjoyed reading it, and I think it's got a lot of concrete, hopeful steps that we can take in it, ideas. And for everybody else, we have an event planned in July. Follow the websites, either mine or amerikahaus, and we hope to see you again, probably online in July, and then we'll see.